The areas function in Excel counts the number of areas in a reference. And an area is a range that's contiguous cells. So these two are contiguous cells or a single cell. And the cells can be empty or they can have data that won't have any effect on the count. Now this areas function isn't as useful as most of the other functions, but we'll take a look at it. It's a good way to see how the reference operators work and what effect they have on the outcome of counting areas. The first example is just a simple one using the function areas, G2, and then the colon H2. So that will look at cells starting with G2 and going to H2. So these two cells, how many areas? And there's one contiguous range of cells, and the result of the formula is 1. So that's a simple example of using areas. And the second one, if we use areas, perhaps we want to include more than one reference to a cell or range of cells. When we do that, we have to include a second set of parentheses. So here we're referring to cell F2, and then with a comma we're creating a union. So we're combining more than one range here into a reference. And the second range is G2 to H2. So we've got two ranges in our reference, and the result is a count of 2 areas. So there are 2 separate areas that it's counting, and even though they really could combine into one contiguous range, it's counting that as the 2 separate areas that we've entered. The third example is looking at the same kind of thing, but in this case we've got F2, and it's right inside the second range, which is F2 to H2, but that doesn't have any influence on the count. Even though it's within the other range, it still counts 2 separate areas. And the next example, we can look at an intersection. So in here we've got the formula areas, test ref 1 and test ref 2. So there are 2 named ranges on this sheet. Test ref 1 is the blue cells. Test ref 2 is the purple cells. In the formula, we use a space between those references, and that's an intersection operator. So the areas this time is looking for cells that are in the intersection. So where do these 2 ranges meet? So these cells that have the thick border are places where those 2 ranges meet. So there should be 3 areas in our count, and that's the result of the formula. And the final example is using the index function. When you use it with a reference, you can indicate what that reference is, the row and column you want, and in a case like this where the reference has non-contiguous ranges, you can specify as your last argument which of those specific areas it should pull the data from. So within the index function here, we're saying use this range, and all the blue cells are in a range called test block. So within test block, in row 5, column 1, and the areas function here tells us how many areas there are. So there are 4 areas, so it will pull from the 4th, the last area. And the result is H5, so we can see in the last area, the 5th row is H5.